Welcome today, where we're going to be discussing all things money. And since it's the beginning of the year, we're going to put our prediction caps on and see what we think might happen in the year 2024. I think I'm going to start with the first prediction in saying that what we predict will probably be wrong. Brendan, you said that you wanted to make your first prediction.
All right, let's start off with a great degree of seriousness. I predict that the Catholic Church will change its doctrine to support same sex marriage. And as a result, 99% of all cardinals will get married in Rome.
Wow. Um, with that
Not
said,
financial, but it might have an
well,
impact.
but with that said, wasn't there a time not too long ago when homosexuality was a sin that you could go to hell for, Brendan?
Oh, without knowing the actual detailed doctrine, yes, of course, it wasn't just a sin in the Catholic Church. It was, and it clearly is a sin in other religions, Islam, for example, as interpreted in certain countries. But there are plenty of countries in the world where it's still a criminal offense even today.
Yeah, I think some of the Arab countries.
Not
Well,
just the Arab nations, there's others as well,
yeah,
African nations.
Indonesia as well. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. But
Uh,
anyway, there,
all right.
that's to start off on a slightly lighter note. So
All right. Well,
hopefully
let's see if
that
Adrian's got one prediction that's non-financial for this year.
A non-financial prediction.
Oh, since the Catholic Church one was a non-financial one, I don't know. Biden's going to be assassinated, or Trump will be assassinated. I don't know. Something crazy.
Well, well, they always assassinate someone who's messing with the status quo there. So I think it's fair to say that what's going to happen is what's happening now in Gaza with the vote in the UN, where now America will be an isolation state almost amongst the world, like North Korea and Russia and China, because of their their support for that. So I can see that around the world, the power of not mass media, of social media. I've been watching it on social media, TikTok and Facebook, the both sides of Gaza, Israel. That will just be duplicated and multiplied with every dispute about borders, which will trickle down to business, source of foods and drinks, machinery, and things like that that are imported, exported between countries. People are going to speak with their money like they're doing at a grassroots level by going to local shops and paying cash as opposed to cards and as opposed to paying the larger chains that are ripping people off and price gouging. People are going to speak much louder than they've ever been heard in the past. And it was that people are not protesting. People are protesting with their money. They are either simply going without and not spending it, or they're choosing the alternative. And that's happening also with their support for things. And it's put pressure on governments. Governments are slowly, it's unbelievable how slow they are in waking up to the fact that voters, consumers, and citizens are extremely well informed about things that are not being covered by the mass media, and wrongly or rightly, whether they get informed with propaganda or fake news, the fact remains they have their own opinion. And there, I think you've got a lot of lessons where there are influencers now who don't set out to be influencers, are changing the way big organizations or the big guys, um, make their decisions about things, to pursue them or not.
Yeah, I tend to think with you, from what I'm seeing, is that the news sources or the news dissemination that we're seeing around the world, it's not consolidated into one or two big corporations anymore. As you said, we've got some more influencers that are rightly or wrongly putting forth their ideas, and some of them are getting big followings. I know Russell Brand, the comedian,
The sex offender.
Brandon's ready to have a go at Russell Brand. By the way, I'm not a fan of Russell Brand, but I do see that he has taken a different viewpoint to the main media. And
Yeah, of course he has. He's a nutter.
He's a nutter that's got a voice.
Yeah. No, he's entitled to his voice, but he's still a nutter.
Yeah, but people are following him. People are listening to him. I did watch one of his videos just out of curiosity last week. I just can't remember what it was about. But I don't remember. All right, so I suppose let's start. The last few years in the financial markets, it's been a tough few years. We've had inflation, interest rate increases, and I think year on year, the market in Australia went up about 5%, which is, I suppose, it's just keeping pace with inflation, although inflation is probably a lot more than what they say it is. So for the next 12 months, do you think that the markets are going to be pretty much the same? Do you think we're going to find that it's going to get harder, or do you think that they might it might be a better year than the last few years?
I'm going to say something that hurts me to say it. I think the financial markets, shares, funds, etc., are going to go up significantly this year, because interest rates are coming down. While I don't disagree with what you say about inflation, it's always important about inflation to be very definite and specific about which inflation measure you're talking about. So the general consumer price index, whether it's core or otherwise, is coming down, mainly because of the fact that it was created mostly by the bottlenecks in the supply chain during COVID. Then it was exacerbated by corporations trying to profiteer on top of it. And then, of course, the interest rates that pushed up have hurt considerably. So there's been three levels for me, but inflation itself is coming down by the measurement, and that impacts people's psychology in a good way. Interest rates are coming down. In fact, US interest rates are likely to come down very significant, because inflation there has come down beneath their 2% target. And then the last thing is profiteering. And, we've all agreed on this in this channel before. That is absolutely appalling what the major corporations have done in Australia and elsewhere. But the only way they react to that is to go back to the normal situation where people shop around. And while I always somewhat disagree with you, Adrian, that people are using local shops more than the chains, and the reason they're using the chains is that's still cheaper. The quality isn't the same, but they are still cheaper for the basics of life. But if people do begin to shop around, you might see downward pressure. And unfortunately, downward interest rate pressures in Australia means two things: the fucking ASX going up and real estate prices going up. And both of those add to a long-term bubble that ultimately is not a good thing.
So I just want to challenge you on the interest rates coming down. I'm in touch with many mortgage brokers, and I'm talking Australia specific now. So I don't know what sources you're citing stating that inflation is coming down and interest rates are coming down. You might have been taking a global view, but for just speaking to mortgage brokers and people in property, the biggest cause of the inflation in property in Australia is the fact that the rental market is so high. So people that need to get a roof over their head are paying rents like they've never paid before. They've gone through the roof, expensive, because the interest rates have gone up, and the people that own their properties need to cover the cost of the mortgage rates. And that's what's causing the boom in the property prices in Australia. Property prices are crazy in Australia.
Yeah.
And that's what's causing the inflation in Australia. And just speaking to mortgage brokers, they tend to think that we've got a few more rounds of interest rates increasing in Australia.
That doesn't make sense, because for two reasons. One is, you're right, and this is why we have to be specific about which inflation we're talking about. So the standard basket of goods and services that creates consumer price inflation is coming down, and has been coming down across the world and in Australia as well. I 100% agree that property prices in Australia are overpriced, and interest rate increases in the last few years have pushed affordability both of rental and purchase markets out of whack. The thing is that when interest rates come down, and if the US dollar interest rate comes down, that has a ripple effect literally across the world. Currency rates, cross currency rates, are determined by the relative interest rates in the relative economies, as we all know. So when interest rates come down, the little countries, Australia, will follow the big countries, the US, and it'll adjust it for local conditions. The other reason that interest rates here are almost certain to come down, in my view, is precisely because the Reserve Bank is aware of the impact that increases in interest rates have had on mortgages and the wider property market as well. There's no reason for them to push up interest rates any further if US interest rates are coming down and inflation in general is coming down, because they can reduce property inflation by reducing interest rates during the year. And I think they'll be cautious. And I'm not an economist, as I kind of stress, but I can't see upward pressure on interest rates, which should mean downward pressure on affordability. And that feeds into major investors who are very cash rich, pushing money back into both property and into financial commodities.
Well, Brendan, I really hope you're right. That's the best news I've heard so far this year.
Well, you started correctly saying we'd probably all be wrong, so I'm going to put my hand up to that one.
Look, I tend to think, I tend to agree with you that I think we will have a good year, but for different reasons. Adrian, what do you think is going to happen in the financial markets in Australia and around the world in the next 12 months? What we've got to look forward to?
I tend to agree with Brendan, actually, because, and, you know, I think we're in for a shock, because there's going to be a lot of pressure on international wars and things. You're going to see more piracy around the world. That is going to have a trickle on, and you're not going to have, what's going to be really interesting in the Commonwealth countries, which people don't often think about the Commonwealth, and the fact that they basically helped save the world twice, is that they're not going to have the take up for people volunteering to go and help out around the world like they used to. And that means they're going to have to pay potentially mercenaries from other countries, which we didn't pay for before. We sent our young people, our young men, from all those countries to go and solve problems that are very directly related to the products that people buy and consume. Because you look at Australia, we're not doing manufacturing. We're also importing a lot of agricultural products from overseas that people don't realize. Those things are going to come into, you know, think of piracy, or just not being able to go through certain international waters because there's conflict there. So it's lucky that we have the intelligence and the computer power now to calculate outcomes and probabilities, because we now are facing a real three-dimensional problem every time there's a conflict in the world. And that goes for the financial markets as well. the financial markets traditionally in times of warfare or conflict have, you know, basically financed that. Now we're looking at a situation where if you're the country that finances the arms going to a conflict, well, that's going to come back threefold. One, you're not going to get your money back necessarily for the payment for them. You're not going to get the goods back, and you're going to get a backlash at home and on the international stage for supplying arms to a country that people around the world, a majority of them, don't believe you should be doing that. And making governments accountable to the people has never been more possible than now. Look at how, I mean, social media gets a really bad rap, but they're actually just an extension of housewives talking over the back fence. Really just doing it en masse. It's the jungle telegraph. It's the guys in the bars. It's just an extension of that. And for people who didn't have a back fence or a bar to go to talk to people, do it through social media because of their age or their immobility, or their busyness. So people are communicating and they're influencing people and persuading them to this side or the other, or not getting people to get engaged with it, treating it as immaturity. I've seen a lot of, I don't know if we can say this on your show, but I've seen a lot of interesting things that we've never seen in the past, where you have Palestinians holding up a placard, and whether it's AI generated or not, it's telling. You know, a woman in a hijab with a placard saying, "Don't do things just because the Nazis did it to you," which is a very psychological thing about trauma.
Yeah.
And hard, that really cuts to something everyone can relate to, that if your parents did something to you, there's a very high chance you will do it to your kids. You need to break the cycle. And what happened to them during the Second World War, they're now doing it, and they have people, citizens from their country, saying that they're doing it even worse than the Germans did during the Second World War to them. Another term I didn't know existed and had to Google it because I thought of it too, is the concept of Zion-Nazis, which is that's a portmanteau, like a combination of two words put together. That, if I'm surprised it hasn't got more mileage, but those are very good litmus tests of what will happen in the Spratly Islands, where it's contested oil fields under the seas there, with China building bases and pissing off the Philippines and Vietnam every turn of the way, plus all the Malaysian states there, Sabah, Sarawak, and the Sultanate of Brunei. And what will also happen in the Pacific with those nations. So people are, you know, what the finance is doing is, you know, they're going to do whatever they're going to do. It's how people respond to them. So if you talk about interest rates going up, well, is everybody, I mean, I studied economics, is if they increase the interest rates, do people behave now the same as they did 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago? The rational economic man making a
Doesn't
decision
exist.
based on factors. That's
Doesn't
exactly right.
exist.
And it exists even less now when you have people belonging to their tribal groups, and you've got the ones that are crypto, the ones that are anti-establishment, the ones that are traditional, the ones that are bricks and mortar minded, the ones that don't trust financial instruments, like CDs and stocks. So I think we're in for a very interesting time in terms of watching people's reactions, because the key to psychology is not the understanding of why someone is behaving a way in particular, it's our reaction to that behavior. So people are pretty literate in using that in their daily lives now and controlling their reactions. They're also controlling their reactions to what politicians and financiers do and what merchants do. They're not doing the traditional knee-jerk reaction to things. People are thinking about stuff, they're researching it, then they're going out on the right foot. They're not being caught on the back foot anymore.
See,
So what I want to
I
do,
don't,
Adrian,
I don't
is
agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to challenge you a little bit about this literate. You're saying people are being more literate, and you mentioned big, what's it, cryptocurrencies, and it reminded me of a story of Elon Musk and how Elon Musk actually manipulated the Bitcoin market. And now, when somebody who is not an expert, if they ring you up and say you've got to get into a market, that's when the market's just about to crash. And my brother rang me up and he said, Paul, you've got to get into Bitcoin. I said, why?
Jesus.
I said, why do you have to get into it? He said, because Elon Musk has recommended it. And I said, well, that's the reason why you should get out of Bitcoin. And then I had another client of mine that put $50,000 in Bitcoin. And I said, why? She said, because there's so much buzz around it that they just wanted to be in it in case the buzz was correct. And then all of a sudden you could buy a Tesla with Bitcoin, and then it went up a little bit more. And then all of a sudden the market crashed. So Elon Musk actually manipulated the market and got a lot of so-called intelligent people into buying Bitcoin. And he was one person. So I suppose the question I want to propose is to both of you, I'll start with Brendan. Do you think that part of the economic cycle is actually manipulated?
Look, that's a very easy answer because it is, and it always has been for the history of the world. And when you were talking about why people get into Bitcoin with the buzz, it reminds me of the story that I think most people know, that John F. Kennedy's father, just before the crash, was getting his shoes shone on the sidewalk in New York City. And the shoe shine boy was polishing his shoes and telling him what stocks to buy. And as Joe Kennedy walked away, he said to himself, if the shoe shine guy is recommending stocks, it's time to get out. He got out, made the equivalent of $1 billion, and everybody else started jumping out of windows. So look, you both know my view of crypto, that it's absolute garbage. Absolute garbage. The technology behind it is massive utility, but crypto is a channel for scams, money laundering, terrorists, and cyber attacks, pretty much exclusively, and it plays on dumb money. So what I challenge about what you said, Adrian, most of which I agree with, but what I challenge is the fact that people have more information doesn't make them more informed. If anything, it makes them more confused. Because if you're following certain influencers, for example, Musk would be slightly on the right side of moral, but only very slightly. But you take anybody who's on slightly the left side of moral, and there are millions of them online and offline, they can all find followers. The one that comes to mind, which is the biggest scam of them all, are mega churches, starting with the Catholic Church and all the way through to the little guy in some armpit, Alabama, who's actually extracting $5 a week from all of his parishioners. It's people have always been fed rubbish, and they accept it when they believe the person who's feeding them. It has to come down to the individual, the personality, the cult, um, the influence, that side of things. So I, that phrase, I love the phrase, do your own research, because it is proven. It's almost a code for you don't know what you're talking about. I did my own research. Vaccines don't work. Sorry, you didn't do your own research. 99.999% of epidemiologists support vaccines, and if you found the one idiot who doesn't, that doesn't make you right. And the same applies to finance.
I don't support vaccines.
Well, look, which means that you haven't done your research.
I'm quite proud to say I don't support it.
Which means you haven't done your research.
I also had we won't go down this track because I had a very young friend of mine die last week. She's 38. And she, there should have been no reason why she passed away. But let's not go. I do not.
Let's
support,
not go there
because I'm talking about the COVID vaccines, right? Okay.
Well,
I
didn't mean to get you down this path, and we shouldn't have concentrated on. You shouldn't have gone on the hook of crypto. What I'm saying is that, yes, of course you're right. People having more information and access to it doesn't mean they're intelligent, but what it does make them is more thoughtful before they make a decision and less knee-jerk reaction. I think if you ask most people now who are educated to some level, they are recognizing that family first, body first, they're looking after their health, they're looking after their local area, because they see it coming that we're going to have to rely on our local communities if something goes wrong, because the big guys they're not just behind the 8 ball anymore. They are really sloppy and not efficient. So what you were saying about the financial markets, are they always manipulated? Of course they are. They just a large version of what happens in a casino. And if you talk to people who repair pokey machines, they will tell you categorically they are don't put your money in, because the guy fixing it knows you're not going to win because he fixed it.
It's a 60% payout. It used to be 80, 90. It's now 60 to 70. They are probably, but to be honest, Adrian, I think that proves my point that pokies and equivalent are more popular than ever because of casino marketing. I cannot get on any streaming channel or any other kind of medium without some Australian betting service putting a really professional, really cool ad up there. I despise them. I despise them more than I despise heroin, because they know exactly what they're doing, and they're appealing to the base emotions of people who think they can beat the system because they're told they can beat the system. And yet those ads state quite clearly you're more likely to lose than win. And I know it's very easy to get on a number of these tracks, but I fundamentally disagree with your contention that more people are more informed. That might work in that instead of 5%, it might be 6%, or 12%, it might be 13%. But the mass of people aren't really thinking about the bigger picture. If they were, climate change wouldn't be an issue.
I won't disagree with you. I agree it's hard to move the majority, but I think you'll find that the majority is more conscious of things now. We have
no,
you have to look at the population. We have a large population of Generation X's who are very silent, but they are quiet achievers. They, by their very nature of their generation, they've got the softest voice out of all the demographics, and yet they are in the seats of power. They are controlling things, and Generation X grew up with Kerry Packer saying under promise and over deliver. And that really is the slogan of that generation in Australia. I think you're right. The majority on the whole is still going to do what they normally do. But what you're going to find is a lot of resistance, and maybe not to the volume that governments and institutions normally expect. They're not going to move the needle as much.
Well, look, I'm not completely disagreeing with you in that the trend is probably right. And politics, the last election probably was a good example where you had the so-called teals actually doing well, but they only did well relatively. They didn't
That's
displace anything major. Now that trend would have to continue for a long time before they made major progress. And probably a lot of the successes were not down to the appeal of the individual candidates, no matter how good or professional or effective they were going to be, but a reaction against the coalition, as led by, the last three prime ministers, in my view, were the poorest three prime ministers in Australia's history. And I generalize with my accent, I'm always careful, but I have no time for any of the last three prime ministers. And so therefore, let me go back and jump in and add one of my other little predictions, if I may, just to take the heat out of the moment. I'm going to predict that King Charles will abdicate as head of state of Australia this year, and that Tony Abbott will seek his endorsement as successor of King of Australia. As a result, Australia will vote to become a republic by a margin of 99%.
That's another very interesting prediction. We have come up to the top of the hour, so I won't have time for rebuttals. But I think I'll just quickly summarize. I think the three of us agree that we're probably going to have a better year this year for those people investing in the markets, and perhaps in property especially, because we're expecting there to be a rally. We all agree that the markets are manipulated. And I think that, Brendan, I'm going to go back to that story that you mentioned about JFK. I think it was his father who was having his shoes shined. And when the shoe shiner told him what shares to buy, that's when he knew when to get out of the market. That has been one of my indicators. I think it's called the bellhop, back about 100 years ago.
Yes, my father said it all the time. When the bellhops start buying, it's time to sell. And look at Australia.
Well, the story is when you hopped into an elevator, into a lift, because you're stuck in a small amount of space. Back 100 years ago, you had somebody that pushed the buttons for you. So that person pushing the buttons got to hear all the discussions in the lift. And they would hear all the discussions about what shares to buy, what shares not to buy. When they became experts in what shares to buy, you know that this is the time to get out of the market. Now, we don't have bellhops anymore in Australia. So what is the closest thing we have to a bellhop? It's a taxi driver or an Uber driver right now. If you hop into an Uber and the Uber driver starts telling you what shares to buy, or if your brother rings you up and tells you to buy Bitcoin, get out of the market. With that, I think I'll have to leave it there. Thanks, guys, for your input today.
Yeah. Well, I think next week we should tell people who to call when someone invites them to something like that.
Well, I've got a few stories about, because of my profession, I don't know about you guys, but I'm finding that the big corporations are becoming more and more distant from the consumers that they should be serving.
Yeah.
Well, I think they're very out of touch, put it that way.
Yeah, we can discuss that next week, because I got as a financial advisor in 23 years, I've never made any complaints to any official bodies until last year. And since then, I've made 3, and I would have made another one, except I just don't have the time to go through that. So against big corporations, they're losing touch. Okay, so thanks, guys.